MacFarlane's main reason for liking relativism is that he thinks it does better than the alternatives, in particular contextualism and moderate sensitive invariantism, on a range of particular objections. He likes relativism because it doesn't suffer, he thinks, from a range of objections that can be either made to contextualism or to invariantism. So let's start by talking about the objections to contextualism. Here there are two objections, and really the second is more serious than the first, but we'll go through the first very quickly. So the contextualist way of understanding knows, when you say knows, you really mean you know relative to a certain standard. You don't say explicitly that that's what you mean, but the context fills in what standard that is. Now there are other words that work like this and that are context sensitive. So for instance, tall is a word that's generally accepted to work like this. If I say that somebody is tall, I can mean according to a variety of different standards. If I say a toddler Billy is tall, what I mean is he's tall by the standards of a toddler. On the other hand, if I say LeBron James is tall, I'm talking about completely different standards. I mean tall for a basketball player. Now, the thing about words like tall is that it does look like you can ask somebody when they say somebody is tall to clarify what standards they mean. So if I say that some random person Alice is tall, you can ask me, well, by what standards? Do you mean for like an adult? Do you mean for like a basketball player or something else? You can ask me to fill in the details in this way, and I can give you a perfectly sensible answer. So if the person is just an ordinary adult, I can say tall for an adult. If I mean tall for a basketball player, I can fill that in too. So with these context-sensitive words that involve standards, at least other ones tend to allow you to clarify what standard you had in mind. But knowledge, it's not obvious that it looks like this. So if I make the claim just to an ordinary person, I know I have hands, it would be kind of a weird question to ask, well, by what standards? I mean, we know that according to contextualism, that question is supposed to make sense. But just thinking about having a conversation with ordinary people about knowledge, that's not kind of a question that you would expect. Moreover, it's not really clear what a good answer to that is, at least in ordinary English is either. So, we've introduced this terminology of high standards and low standards. But just kind of speaking as an ordinary English speaker, it's not obvious that it's really great English to say, oh, I know by high standards, or I know by low standards, or I know by ordinary standards. These just aren't the kinds of things that ordinary people go around saying, MacFarlane thinks. And this is kind of puzzling if knowledge is supposed to work like tall. If we're supposed to fill in this standard from the context in a similar way that we do with tall, then why can't we just make it explicit? Why don't we have ways in ordinary language of making explicit what kind of standard we're interested in? This to me doesn't seem like a devastating objection. It's not 100% obvious why there would have to be these sort of clarifications in ordinary English in order for a word to count as context sensitive. But it is interesting and maybe striking that there is this difference between knowledge on the one hand and other things which are standardly taken to be context sensitive. So maybe room for a little bit of concern, but not something I think that's a knockdown argument by any means. An argument that is much more pressing, I think, is the argument from disagreement. So when we've been thinking about people with different standards, we usually have not thought of them as in the same context. So we've been thinking about cases where high standards people have been assessing low standards people in different contexts and maybe vice versa. But we haven't really been thinking about contexts when they're directly in contact with each other and what happens there. Now, if we first think about what actually happens in the real world, what actually seems to happen is that people disagree. So if you are a non-skeptic and you say things like, I know my car is parked outside, and there's a person like Billy the skeptic around, Billy the skeptic will tend to say things like, no, you don't know that. You can know that because you might be afraid of that. So there seems to be some real disagreement here. You are putting forward one claim about your knowledge, it seems, and Billy is expressing a different claim about your knowledge that seems to be in contradiction. Or put another way, he seems to be rejecting your claim about your knowledge. The problem for contextualism is that it's not really obvious how to make sense of this. Because it actually seems like contextualism predicts that they're just talking past each other. Because according to the contextualist, at the start of the conversation, when you say that you know you have hands, what you're saying is, you know by low standards that you have hands, or you know by ordinary standards that you have hands. And this is just a true claim about you. not one the skeptic should dispute. Likewise, when the skeptic says, no, you don't know that, they're just making a completely different claim. They're not making any claim about low standards at all. Rather, they're saying, it's not true that you know by high standards that you have hands. The problem is, though, that these claims are completely consistent. It can both be true of you at the one time that you know that by low standards you have hands, and that you don't know by high standards. So then the question is, well, why is there any disagreement, or why is there felt to be any disagreement here in the first place? Because it should be that the skeptic and the non-skeptic don't disagree about the facts. According to contextualism, it looks like they should completely agree on the facts. They're just choosing to talk about different things. And this doesn't usually suffice for disagreement. Just choosing to use your words in different ways doesn't usually suffice for disagreement. So one way to see this is to think about other context-sensitive words. So suppose you say, I'm hungry, and I say, no, I'm not hungry. That's a very strange disagreement to have, or at least it seems weird for me to try to disagree that way. Because me saying I'm hungry just means David Boylan is hungry, and you saying you're hungry means you, whoever you are, is hungry. But both of those two things are completely consistent. Obviously, one person can be hungry and while the other person isn't. And that's why we don't seem to be able to disagree with each other in this way. I can't disagree with your claim that you're hungry by saying, I'm not hungry, because that claim is just completely consistent. I'd have to say, you're not hungry, or something like that. So when we have these context-sensitive words, we shouldn't in general expect that we would be able to have disagreements by one person saying P and the other person just saying not P. Because P means something different in the first person mouth to the second person mouth. In particular, these can be things that are just completely consistent. So we should expect that people are talking past each other when they do this. The problem is that's not really what's happening. It doesn't look like the skeptic and the non-skeptic are talking past each other. It looks like there's a real disagreement going on. It's very different from the case of you saying I am hungry and me saying I'm not hungry. There the contextualist prediction looks right. It looks like we really are talking past each other. In the case of knowledge, however, and knows, the prediction looks wrong. The prediction is that we should be talking past each other, just like we are in the case of I'm hungry. But that doesn't really look like what's happening. What looks like it's happening is that we are having a real disagreement. And contextualism doesn't look like it can explain this. So those are the criticisms of contextualism. And really the second one about disagreement is the one that MacFarlane will want to put weight on. This is the really decisive one, and the one that he thinks is going to motivate relativism. Now, invariantism isn't going to have either of these problems, because remember, invariantism is not a context-sensitive view. It's in the name, it's invariant. However, there are plenty of problems for invariantism, as we saw last week. And the kinds of problems that MacFarlane thinks it has are basically just the kind that we already saw. So for instance, we saw that invariantists are committed to this sort of controversial idea that knowledge gets destroyed. And this allows you to say kind of strange things, like, you know, David used to know that he wasn't going on safari this year until he started doing some lottery reasoning and lost his knowledge. We saw that those are kind of counterintuitive things to say. Likewise, we saw that you should, according to invariantism, be able to say things like, well, if it's true that my lottery ticket is going to lose, then if I wasn't worrying about whether it was going to lose, I would know that it's going to lose. And again, that's a kind of strange thing to think. We don't intuitively think that worrying about lotteries or worrying about brain vat situations can destroy your knowledge in this way. The thing that's interesting for MacFarlane, and the thing maybe we can add to our discussion from before, is really when you're in the mood of thinking you don't know these things, when you're in the mood of thinking you don't know that your lottery ticket will lose, or you're in the mood of thinking you don't know that you have hands, you don't think that you've lost your knowledge, or you don't describe other people as having lost your knowledge. Rather, the tendency is to think that you never knew that. Once you're in this kind of frame of mind, really you think that I actually was wrong in the past when I thought I had that knowledge before. It's not that I lost anything. It's rather I'm just sort of like seeing things more clearly now. That's the kind of phenomenon or phenomenology we get when we're in these sort of high stakes contexts. And this is a further thing we want to explain, something that he thinks relativism will explain, that when our knowledge goes away, in some sense, we're actually inclined to say we never had it all along.